of us spend hours and hours trying to learn chess openings and chess tactics, but often forget to study endgames. Now, several world champions, such as José Raúl Capablanca, said that endgames are the most important thing to study in chess to improve, and that you should study endgames before you study anything else. Well, that is why today, everybody, I'm going to be showing you 5 different pawn endgames that you must know to not commit stupid mistakes at the end of the game. The first thing to know about pawn endgames is that pawn endgames are really forcing, and most of the time, one single move can change the outcome of the whole game. You know, if it's black's turn in certain positions, it can be a draw, but if it's white's turn in that exact same position, it can be winning. And this example right here is one of those, okay? So what I want to show you with this example is what we call the box. Now, the box simply means a box of squares that if the king can get into, it's a draw because the king can stop the pawn. So let me show you this example. So in this example, we see that white has this pawn, this extra pawn. Black doesn't have any pawn. And this pawn is right now 1, 2, 3 squares from promoting. Now, for black to be able to stop this pawn, black needs to have their king enter the box. The box in this position would be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is the box. The way to calculate the box is that you calculate how many steps the pawn needs to promote, and then you take those steps and then you put them, you know, to the left, down, and then to the right. And the same thing, I mean, now the king cannot go beyond the H file, but the same thing would be applied if the king was able to go, you know, this way. Now, what this means is that if right now it would be white to move, white would win because the king is not in the box. But if it was black to move in this position, it would become a draw because black would be able to go king c5 and enter the box. So if right now it was black to move, black would be able to go king c5. Pawn moves, king goes up, pawn moves, king goes up, and black is in time to stop the pawn. This is really crucial in the box. Is something that you should apply to, you know, all your pawn endgames. If your opponent has an extra pawn, if you want to try to stop that pawn with your king, if you want to try to calculate if you can do it, always use the box. The second endgame you must know is the endgames about opposition. Opposition basically means that the two kings sort of stand in front of each other. So for instance, if white would go king c5, this would be opposition. Okay, so when you're trying to win an endgame with king and pawn versus king, what you want to do is that you want to put your king in one of the squares that support promotion. If you have a c pawn that's trying to promote, then c8 is a promotion square. You want to get your king to either b7 or d7. If you would have an e pawn that's trying to promote, you would try to go to d7 or f7. Okay? So what black needs to do in this position is that black needs to stop white from getting to one of these two squares. Now, if it's white to move in this position, white is winning, but if it's black to move, then it is a draw. So basically, for white to win, white needs to enter opposition, and for black to win, black needs to enter opposition. So let me show you what that means. In this position, if it's white to move, then white can go king c5, and now it's opposition, which means that black needs to move the king out of the opposition, which is exactly what black doesn't want to do. Now if black goes king b7, white can go king d6. Okay, now we're getting closer to getting to our dream square of d7. If black would go king b6, then white can simply go c5, check. And if the king goes to b7 now, then there is king d7, and we finally get to the square we want to go to. If we get to this square, there's nothing black can do that can stop white from promoting. Now, in this position, after king d6, let's say that black doesn't go king b6. Let's say that black goes king c8. Now, once again, we enter opposition. In this position, we go king c6, opposition, and now black needs to go with the king to either b8 or d8. There's nowhere else the king can go to. And no matter where the king goes, we will finally get to one of the two squares that we want to reach to be able to promote the pawn. Now, there is nothing that black can do to stop the pawn from promoting, you know? We will promote the pawn. This will now become a queen. So there's nothing that black can do here. But let me show you now what the difference is if it would be in this initial position if it was black to move. If it was black to move here, then black would be the one entering opposition because black would be able to go king d6, opposition. If now, for instance, the king would go somewhere like king c3, then black can once again go king c5, opposition. Okay, let's say that the king here would go something like to b3. Then black can go king c6, go back, and after king b4, opposition. Now, after c5 check, black does the same thing as what we were saying before, taking one step back in a different file than the file that the king is in. And this is just to keep on doing the same method throughout the whole way, just for the simplicity of it. Now, if for instance king b5, there is king b7, opposition. Remember, only one square in between. If now black went king b8, then white would have king b6, and now white would enter opposition, and this would be lost for black. So really important, only one square in between. So king b7, and now the only thing that white can do to improve the position is once again to go c6 check. The king goes to c8, taking one step back in a different file. Now, don't go king a8. This is going to be losing, so you need to constantly protect the promotion square. So king c8, and now if king b6, opposition. Once again, put the king in front of the other one. And now, if for instance, you know, the king would go to a6, there is king c7, king b5. And now, once again, you go king c8. You take one step back in the file that is next to white's king, okay? But the file that's still defending the pawn promotion. And after king b6, opposition. The only thing that white can do here to advance is to go c7 check. And after king c8, the only move that white has to still defend the c7 pawn is to go king c6. And now it's a stalemate. The king cannot go anywhere, which means that this is a draw. It's a stalemate. So opposition is a really important thing to know when it comes to pawn endgames. So this is definitely something that is super important, and take your time to study this in case you feel like this went a little bit too fast, or if you feel like, you know, I missed anything. Really take your time to study this because this is crucial when it comes to pawn endgames. The next endgame is the pawn endgame, where the extra pawn is either on the A or H file. We call these the rook files. It's really important to know that to draw this endgame, in this case is black, what you need to do is that you need to place your king on B8 or A8. If your king ever reaches any of these two squares, it will be a draw. So that is what you need to remember. Now, you need to find a way to be able to place your king over there. So, in this position, we're going to apply a term that I talked about before, which is the box, to calculate what's happening. So if white is winning or if it's a draw. So let's say that it's white to move. There's 1, 2, 3 squares. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, this is the box. The king has not entered this box, which means that if it's white to move, the king will not be in time to stop the pawn. But if it's black to move, on the other hand, then black will have time to enter the box. So in this position, if it's black to move, it is a draw because there is the move king d8. So here, if white would go a6, there is king c8, a7, king b7, and the king is in time to stop the pawn. But let's say that white tries to complicate things a little bit and starts bringing up their own king. After king d8, let's say that white goes king b5. Well, in this position, you're just trying to reach the square of b8. So you just go king c8 or king c7, it doesn't matter. And now let's say that black goes king b6. You will go king b8. White cannot really do anything over here. So let's say that white goes a6. Then you will go king a8. And after a7, it's a draw. There's nothing you can do because it's a stalemate. So it's a draw. The king cannot move anywhere. Let's say that after king a8, the king tries to go to c7 to stop you from going to b8. Well, then you do the only move that's allowed, which is king a7. And now the white king cannot defend on a6. So now you win the pawn, and if there's only 2 kings left, it's a draw. So this is everything you're trying to do. Now let's say that, white goes king a6 in this position instead of a6. You go king a8, and white will literally not be able to do anything because of the fact that there is no file to the left of the a file. If right now the king could sort of go here to a square next to a7, this would be winning for white, but there is no square as such, and that is why if you get a king to b8 or a8, then it's a draw. Same thing on the h file. If you get a king to g8 or h8, it's a draw. All right? So here, the term of opposition is not like in the previous example where we talked about pawns being on the B, C, D, E, F, or G files. Now, the next endgame you need to know is an endgame where the color has 2 extra pawns, but the pawns are 1 square away from each other. Now, this is winning for white, but you need to make sure to not overextend your pawns, and you need to make sure to bring your king in. Now, in the final bonus example that I'll show you, I'll be talking about the importance of bringing the king in, and I'll give you a really beautiful example of how important it is to have your king active in pawn endgames. But I just wanted to show you this very quickly because here I've seen many players go wrong by simply overextending their pawns. If this pawn would be on c4 instead of d4, and there would be 2 squares between the 2 extra pawns, then you can simply just push, and the king will be too far away to stop both pawns. But when there is only 1 square in between, you need to make sure that you bring your king in if you want to win. So, for instance, let me show you how you can go wrong here. You could go wrong by going f5, king d7, d5, king e8, and f6. This is now a draw. Because in this position, black can go king f7, and because the pawns are so close to each other, the king will always be in the square, so the king will always be able to stop both pawns. So here, let's say that the king goes up, you just take the pawn, and after something like king c4, there is king e7. After something like king d4, there's opposition. After something like king c5, then there is king d7. Important to not go king d8 because then there is opposition. So king d7, and now after, for instance, the pawn pushes, then there is king d8, and now if king c6, king c8, it's opposition. Okay, so now we have the same endgame as what I showed you in example number 2. Now, this is why it's so important that if you have these 2 pawns, that you make sure that they are next to each other and that you don't over push them. So if you place one of the pawns on the 6th file, if you place one of these 2 pawns on the 6th file, and only one of them, because if both of the pawns were in the 6th file, then that would be different. But if you only, let's say, let me just show you this. This position would also be winning, because at any point that the king goes to f7, there is d7, and there is no time of stopping the promotion. The king cannot go here. But never overextend your pawns as such that there is one pawn that is in front of the other. Always keep your pawns next to each other and bring the king in. So a simple way of winning this as white would simply be to just bring the king in. So for instance, just something like this. And now it's going to be a lot easier. You go check. I don't know where the king goes, maybe to f8. Now you push the next pawn. And now you will be able to protect the pawns and then protect the promotion of it as well. So I just wanted to show you the example. It's really important to bring your king in. And now let's get right to, well, the last one of the first 5 examples that I wanted to show you, and then I'll show you a bonus one. So the 5th one that's really important to know, and this one is quite beautiful, is what happens when there is 3 pawns versus 3 pawns. Typically you would think that if it's the same amount of pawns in a pawn endgame, it should be a draw, because at the end of the day, all pawns will be blocking each other, etc. And actually, if white goes something like king e2 in this position, it's a draw. Now you can take a moment right here to pause the video and try to figure out why this position right here is winning for white, actually, if it's white to move, and white, if it was black to move, if for instance, if white didn't move like king e2, if it was black to move, why it would be a draw. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, it's the same thing as before. Right now, it's the king, black's king, is really far away. And actually, there is a really beautiful tactic when there's 3 versus 3 pawns. So in this position where white has been able to overextend their pawns this much, the pawns are actually just 3 squares away from promoting. We can say that this king is 1, 2, 3, 4 squares from stopping the promotion, which means that if it's white to move right now and white would somehow be able to get through these pawns, then white would be promoting because the king is not in the box. There's actually a way to get a passed pawn right now is white. A passed pawn is a pawn that cannot be stopped by any other pawns. The way to do so, and this is the only way, and a really important thing to remember, is by going b6. Now, when you're going b6, what's happening is that you're challenging 2 pawns at the same time. You're challenging the a7 pawn and the c7 pawn. And it doesn't really matter what black does here. It's winning for white. So let's say that black would, ignore this and just go c6. Well, then white captures the a7 pawn and promotes. Let's say black goes a6, white captures the c7 pawn and promotes. There's no way of stopping it. So black needs to capture on b6. Now, when black captures on b6, let's say that black captures with the a pawn, then we don't capture back, because if captures back, then the pawns are going to be blocking each other. But instead, we challenge the next pawn. The next pawn that there is to be challenged is this b7 pawn right behind. Now, it's really important to, in this position, go c6 and not a6, because if a6, we're challenging the pawn, takes c6, the pawn is blocked. No, in this position, you need to go c6. You're challenging this b7 pawn, and the only thing that black can do is to capture the pawn back, because if black doesn't do anything, let's say that black captures this a5 pawn, then white will be able to capture on b7, and there will be nothing to do to stop the pawn from promoting. So black needs to capture this c6 pawn, and all of a sudden we have created this beautiful pathway for the a pawn, and now the a pawn is a passed pawn that cannot be stopped. So let me just show you why it was important for the king to be here. It's because let's say that black would capture with the c pawn. Well, then we need to do the same thing as we did before, but we need to create a pathway for the c pawn. Because now if c6, pawn takes a6, the pawn is blocked by the a pawn. So we need to sacrifice the a pawn, challenge the b pawn. Now the b pawn takes on a6, because there's nothing, if the king goes here, we just capture the pawn and promote. So the pawn captures on a6, and now we have created this pathway for the c pawn. It's a passed pawn. And now after c6, we can see that the king is not in the square. The king is not, no, and after c6, we can see that the king is not in the box. So the king is 1 move too far away from stopping the promotion. And that is why in this initial position, if it was black to move and black would have time to go to f8, then black would have time to stop the c-pawn from promoting, and that's why it would be a draw. But if it's white to move here, there is this b6 idea. And this idea is always good to keep in mind in pawn endgames so that you can always think back to it, because a lot of times there will be different positions where there is a sort of breakthrough that like this that will make you be able to create a passed pawn and win the game. So this is always a really good thing to remember. So in this final example, the bonus example, I want to show you a game between Eric Kahn and Akiba Rubinstein. Now, Rubinstein is considered to be one of the greatest chess players of all time to have never become a world champion, and this game was played in the year 1909. Rubinstein was also known for being really, really good at endgames, and he created a lot of endgame theory. So, in this position, we can see that white and black have the same amount of pawns, but there is a really big difference, which is that white has one set of double pawns. Now, what I want to show you in this example is how important it is to have a good pawn structure and what can happen in an endgame where you have a set of double pawns. Having good pawns is typically characterized by having pawns that are next to each other and that are all together, because they're sort of right now creating a barrier for the king to not be able to enter and attack the pawns. In white's position, on the other hand, we can see that because the pawn is now on f3 instead of g2, this square right here is a big weakness, and if white is not careful, black will be able to enter white's position by placing the king on g2, and then the pawns will fall like domino bricks. So black is in this endgame going to be much more active than what white is going to be. And as we know, having an active king in endgames, especially in pawn endgames, is vital. It's super, super, super important. So let me go ahead and show you how the game unfolded. King f6, king d2, we can see how black immediately tried to take control of that g2 square, and now white did everything to stop black's king from entering. So king h3, king g1, defending the h2 pawn, and now black has basically placed their king on the best position possible, as active as it possibly can be, and white is right now going to be stuck going king g1 and king h1 at some point, because if the king ever goes anywhere else, then the h2 pawn is going to fall. So now black started to improve the position of the pawns, going e5, king h1, b5, stopping white from going a4, and also blocking this pawn. Right now, black has blocked both of these pawns. King g1, f5, king h1, there's not a lot more that white can do. Right now, if for instance white would go f4, then black would be able to capture and capture, and they go king g4, and then the pawn on f4 would fall. There's no pawn or king that can defend it. And now after g5, once again, black just keeps on putting all pawns in the best position possible. White cannot do anything. Black is able to get through with going g4. And now if white would capture on g4, then after f takes g4, the king needs to go back to g1. This is really beautiful. This was not what happened in the game, but black can go e4. And right now, all pawns are blocked. All of white's pawns are blocked. So the king is the only piece that can move. And after king h1, there is h4. King g1, there is g3. And after a set of exchanges, we can see that the king will be able to capture this pawn on e3, and white's king will not be in time to defend it, so black will be able to promote the e-pawn. And something quite similar happened in this position. After g4, white realized this and went e4 in a desperate attempt. But in this position, what black did was pretty much the same thing as what we saw before, capturing on e4, and after captures, going h4, and now after this exchange of pawns, well, now actually white resigned, but after this exchange of pawns, then white would not be in time to defend its own pawn. So here we can see how important it is to have an active king. And because white wasn't able to do anything apart from going king g1, king h1, and going back and forth, black was able to set all their pieces to the best position and finally capture finally capture a pawn. Now, let's say in this position that that white would have gone f3, then this is really beautiful because, okay, there's several things that black can do, but black can go a6, and now white is in a zugzwang. I mean, white cannot move any of the pawns because they're all blocked. Black will capture them. And if the king goes to, for instance, to h1 right now, like before, then there is g2 check, and after king g2, there is king g3, and now white, king-wise, is in a stalemate. I mean, the king cannot go anywhere, so white needs to push one of the other pawns, either the a pawn or f pawn, and then black will be making a queen in checkmating. So I just thought that this was a really beautiful example of how important it is to have a good pawn structure in endgames, and also how important it is to have an active king. And yeah, I hope that was instructional for you. Okay, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed these 5 different pawn endgames that you must know. Hopefully this was instructional for you and you learned something that you can bring to your own games. Let me know once again in the comments down below if you want to see me doing this for other endgames such as rook, knight, bishop, queen endgames, you name it. Whatever you want, let me know down in the comments down below. Have a very, very, very wonderful day, everybody, and I'll see you all in the next video. Whee!